Good evening. Well, to those of you at home, welcome to this another edition of Update with Sion Marshall. As you can notice, it's a little different, which means that I am not in my usual studio space, but you'll hear more about that as we get to this evening's program. Thank you so much for joining, and Update with Sion Marshall begins right now. Good evening again, and thank you for joining. Now, as I said, you would notice that this evening's program is a little different. And one of the reasons for this is because it is recorded. It has been recorded much earlier in the day to facilitate this evening's broadcast. But I have a very interesting program in store for you. You see on my left someone who you're totally unfamiliar with, and I'll get into that a little bit uh, later. Now, later on, well, earlier today, you should have seen on the YouTube channel the lecture done by the gentleman on my left. So let me kill all the suspense and introduce you to my guest this evening. With me this evening on my left is someone who taught me, a professor of international environmental law at Strathclyde University in Glasgow, Scotland. And yes, I'm in Scotland. It's cold, but yes, Professor Francesco Sindico. Professor, good. Well, it's what, morning? So good morning.
Morning,
So, good
evening,
evening.
evening to your viewers. I'm delighted to have you back at Strathclyde, back in Glasgow. And yes, it is cold, but at least it's beautiful and sunny.
You said
So don't
beautiful.
complain too much.
You said beautiful and sunny.
Yeah.
Sunny matters when you can feel the sun. I can't feel the
I
sun.
focus on clouds. So if it's sunny and cold, it's okay.
Okay. How have you been? It's been a while. I did the program back in 2016, 2017, and then that's it. How has it been for you over the last couple of years?
It's been a big trip over the last 8 years. I think I've had an incredible opportunities. Obviously, I stayed in university. I continued working here at Strathclyde, but I also had a number of opportunities outside of university, which I'm very happy to discuss and chat about. For example, I worked now twice before the International Court of Justice. So that has brought me very much to better understand how both adversarial, country against country, but now advisor opinion works beyond just the books. Often what happens when you're in a university, when you're teaching, is that you convey what's in the books. But if you don't really live it, if you don't experience it, I'm sure you yourself, when you were,
Yeah.
in your environment, you feel that. So I had these opportunities. I have established very strong relationships with at least two organizations. One is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Another one is the International Water Resources Association. And also, for almost 3 years, I worked for the Scottish government. So I actually left the university for 4 days a week. I ended up in government. I had all the perks and the challenges of working in government. And I worked on something called the Carbon Neutral Islands Project, which was supporting 6 islands in Scotland to become carbon neutral by 2040. So I'm coming back into university re-energized, if you want, and wanting to really engage with my students in a different way, in a more practical way, in, yes, explaining what's out there in the COP processes and the climate change legal world, but beyond what is just on the books.
Mm. And of course, recently you've gotten a big promotion. You've now gone from, what was it, reader?
Yeah.
From reader to full professor. What's that like? First of all, congratulations from me.
Thank you very much. It's very good because nobody understands what a reader is, so I can finally just say professor. I have to say it's a bit awkward because I actually got this promotion 2.5 years ago, but it was in the midst of my first case before the ICJ. I was working for the Scottish government. It wasn't really the time to celebrate. I was so busy. I'm still quite busy, but this year is the 60th anniversary of the law school here at Strathclyde. And I was very lucky that the head of school and the university allowed me to bring in this year of celebrations, also my inaugural lecture to mark the becoming a professor of international environmental law. But yeah, it's been a bit in the making.
What is your role at the Strathclyde Law School?
Yeah. So obviously I'm a professor there, so I teach, I do research in various areas, especially international climate change law, but also international water law and so forth. Over the years, as you know, I was managing a program master, the one that you were involved in, which unfortunately is not running anymore. I directed a research center called the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance that now has been brought into the wider research environment of the law school. And what I look forward to doing starting in January, when I come back to it full time, I'm on research leave until January, is also looking at the wider sustainability, not just of the law school, but of the university. So there's a sustainability director role within the university and within the law school, and I will be taking that role forward as well. But that's up to me. I mean, I teach, I research, I have my citizenship roles, but I always like to do it also with colleagues and partnerships outside of the university. I already did that before we met in 2016, but now because of the experiences I had, I want to do it even more.
Okay. Your expertise is in environmental law, international environmental law, and like you said, and I can testify to it, you were part of that program, climate change law and policy, which I did, and I found it to be quite enlightening. Um, Now that that program isn't running anymore, do you have any intentions of, because climate change is still a very big issue, of incorporating any type of study in that area, for individuals who might be
Oh,
interested?
yes, absolutely. I mean, I would say that compared to 2016, we're now in 2024, almost 2025. Climate change, be it the law, the policy, the litigation, has boomed tremendously. So there's an incredible appetite and there's an incredible interest and a need to be trained in climate change law. We do that through our own master programs that's called Global Environmental Law and Governance, where I do teach climate change and international law. I do it through a social enterprise called the Climate Change Legal Initiative, CSI. So in my day-to-day work, I teach and I do and I speak and I work climate change law every day. And I'm delighted to do it with any partners and students, obviously, who work with me.
A few years ago, Francesco, when I was in St. Vincent, you reached out to me, and there was a bit of a project that you started. I can't remember, I'm hoping that you can give some specifics of it, where you paired up some students in Scotland, that might have been the same net zero project, I'm not sure, with some students in St. Vincent, and it was the Fitzhugh Government School. My friend Mortal was the principal at the time, and I was able to connect those students in Fitzhugh's with the students in Scotland. Tell us a little bit about that project and how did that go?
Delighted you asked, because to be honest, this was probably the most rewarding project I have ever done. And it has very little of academic law in it, too. I mean, it was called Island Explorers. And what it was an effort to introduce sustainability to primary school pupils here in Scotland. So pupils that were between 7 and 10, 11 years old, in a multidisciplinary, gradual, and fun way. And it was called Island Explorers because we matched, as you just said, schools here in Glasgow, a big city in Scotland, with islands in Hawaii, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in a small island here in Scotland, in Great Cumbria, and in the Ile de Réunion in the Indian Ocean. So every island, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines, had a school that connected with our schools here in Glasgow. And every year, there was a different topic. So, for example, for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the topic was sustainable energy. For Hawaii, it was marine plastics. We had food security for the P6s, the 10 years old. And for the older kids, just 10, 11, the idea was to look at oceans and biodiversity. And really, what it did, it brought the 3 years together, and they understood in a fun and multidisciplinary way that the three were actually connected and raised this thing called sustainable development. It worked so well because it was a project that gave the schools and the teachers a product, if you want, that they could then mold and adapt to their own curriculum needs. It came with a number of very low cost and simple instruments, if you want, card games or stuff like that. And it wasn't a one-off. Often here in Scotland, what happens, you have, with all the respect, an engineer comes in, explains how a light bulb works, leaves, and the pupils and the teachers are almost more confused than anything else. This was over 6 weeks, gradual sessions every week. It created a group kind of mentality. The pupils got together to find the solution to the sustainable energy challenge, say, at St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They produced a video or a music or a poem or whatever it was, and then they pitched it back to these pupils in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So there was this connection via video of the two schools. And then, especially the first year was amazing. We were able to bring over 400 pupils to the university, and they were celebrated even by the principal and everything. The last thing I'll say about this project is that it has grown, and it has now fed into, and I think the seeds of it have led to, similar to some extent, projects called Ocean Explorers in the Solomon Islands in the Pacific, and also in schools in the Netherlands and in Iceland through a European project. It's been a really great experience. I would be delighted to continue doing it, and maybe I will.
Let's now. Maybe I should take a quick break because I want to switch segments, because what I want to talk with now with Professor Sindico is the issue of climate change litigation, which is one of his areas, and we talked about working ICJ. So let's take a very quick break, take an ad break, and then when we come back, we discuss with the professor climate change litigation. Don't go away.
The light changes.
Covering 150 years of history, relating the story of 5 generations. It took 12 years to write, and now it's finally here. The story of Pauline Bramble, Springs, Blossoms, and Young Thorns, a literary masterpiece by Dr. Richard A. Byron Cox, author of the critically acclaimed Where Mama Stares in Vain. Pauline Bramble's story is your great-great-grandparents, great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, and your story. It is our story of pain, love, tears, and joys, our story of struggle with no surrender. It's a golden gift to our nation as we mark 45 years of independence. Get your copy and a gift for a friend for this independence from Games Bookshop, Career City Store, Giggles at AIA, and Jazzy's at the Cruise Ship Berth. It is our story like never told before. The story of Pauline Bramble. Read it and be inspired.
Welcome back to our second segment. And a while ago, Professor Sindico, well, you know what? All through the course, that's how we follow Francesco. And when we speak, it's Francesco. So maybe, thank you very much. Yes. Francesco has co-authored a number of books. So this is his latest one, Research Handbook on Climate Change Litigation. And for someone who is currently doing the bar training program here in the UK and do have a keen interest in climate change litigation, I'm delighted that Francesco has actually given me a copy of his book. The previous book I bought, which also deals with climate change litigation as well. So, for those of you who might be interested in pursuing or just the general topic of climate change litigation, hey, get a copy of this book. All right. Now, the issue of climate change litigation. First of all, give us a bit of a backstory of the rise of it or the popularity of it and exactly where that is today.
So I think maybe especially for those who are not 100% every single day into law and everything, it's important to just get the sense of what we even mean by litigation.
Yes.
And I would say there are probably 3 ways of seeing it. One is when you and your country, be it an individual or society, considers that the government is not doing enough, let's say, when it comes to climate change. So we want more ambition, and you push your government to do more. And that can happen in courts in many countries. The other thing is when you focus on a specific thing, on a specific project that is authorized by a public body. That could be the construction of an airport or of a port or supermarket, something like that. And if you believe that that again is leading to more climate change because of the greenhouse gas emissions, or it leads to maladaptation, so adaptation is not fully considered, again, in most countries you can bring that. The third, which is rising even more now, is when individuals or organizations sue private sector. So sue actual companies whose activities are increasing climate change. And that could be oil giants, that could be investment firms, that could be pension funds, that could be airlines. And we are now seeing all of these three kinds of cases. And this wasn't the case until relatively recently. The moment when all of these kind of litigation really starts, like a wave, like a tsunami, was with the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And there was a reason because of that. Because in 2015, all the countries of the world get together, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and decide for an architecture of fighting against climate change, where every single state has the obligation, has to do it, to create a plan to deal with climate change. So that is the legal obligation. It doesn't matter who you are in the world, you have to have a plan. In technical terms, it's called the nationally determined contribution. Now, however, what you put in the plan, how fast you go with the plan, where you go with the plan, is completely up to the state. But most states, what they do is they put this plan and they put it into legislation. And in the legislation, they will say, our target is 30% by 2030 based on 2019 levels, for example. Our target is to increase adaptation by doing X, Y, Z. The moment it's in legislation, that's when litigation can come in. Because the moment anywhere in the world you have something in your domestic legislation, then as a lawyer, as an international, as an organization, you can cling on that legislation and ask for accountability through litigation. There's a new kind of litigation which is just emerging, which is international litigation. And this is where you have countries who may consider that they are least responsible for climate change and want to address this not just by talking to other countries around the room in negotiations, but actually by pointing the finger to the big countries in the world, the Chinas, the USAs, and saying, you need to do more and compensation for the greenhouse gases where sea level rise and havoc in my country. Now, we're not there yet. There's not yet a case where you have a small island developing state, for example, or a least developed country, or any country suing another state because of this kind of situation. But what we have, this is the case I am involved, are a plethora of advisory opinions before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and before the International Court of Justice. And in a way, what is happening is that we are asking to these three courts to clarify the rules, to clarify what states should be doing to protect the climate system. And once those rules are further clarified, I speculate that these kind of cases I just mentioned may start coming.
Well, you introduced it because while you were talking, I said, okay, you're talking about citizens to government, you're talking about companies, to private citizens to companies, but you haven't said anything about countries to countries. And to me, that seems to be where we are going, because you have countries like mine that are small island developing states that are most vulnerable. And on the other hand, you have larger countries like the US that say, no, you know what, climate change, folks, we're going to authorize more drilling than anything else in the next 4 years. And at the same time, our lives are at risk. And there seems to be no way of holding the larger countries accountable. You referenced the climate agreement. That's something I'm familiar with. The 2015 climate change agreement, commonly referred to as the Paris Agreement. Is that Do you consider that as someone who's in the system as an architecture of real value and worth and teeth, or is it really a feel good something that large countries got involved in so that they could pat themselves on the back and say, oh, we're trying something to help the smaller countries? And I don't want to be cynical as someone who lives with, but I just have to ask.
It really depends on how I wake up in the morning. No, I'll try to answer that. I mean, I think we have to be careful not to think that litigation will solve everything or that the Paris Agreement will solve everything. If we're talking litigation between states, to be honest, we have a similar problem with the Paris Agreement, which is we are talking about sovereign states. What I mean by that is that we can be happy or unhappy with elections anywhere, say the US now, but not just the US. But when it comes to the negotiation process, be it the Paris Agreement or the Plastics Treaty or biodiversity or anything, we are stuck in a world where sovereignty counts more than anything else. And we may not like it, but unless we find a different kind of world to live in, we need to work within these parameters. So why I'm saying this is that, okay, litigation at domestic level sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. And it works why? Because judicial decisions, even in your country, can be enforced. That doesn't happen in international law, except for some very minor international trade, international investment, maybe cases. When it comes to a country against another country before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea or the International Court of Justice, even if you win, whether the other party does what the judges said they should do becomes a political issue. There's no UN police, there's no UN inspection authority that will come and steal and get your house or get your mortgage or so forth. So we do need to acknowledge the system that we live in. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to say, oh, everything works perfectly, the Paris Agreement is perfect. No, the Paris Agreement is not perfect. But let's not forget why we have the Paris Agreement in the first place. We have it because what happened before, the division between Annex 1 states, the rich, non-Annex 1, the not so rich countries, was just not working. The Kyoto Protocol was not working. It wasn't creating that confidence, that trust within all the states to come up with a solution to climate change. But the reality, and this is when I just wake up from the wrong side, we just don't have time. We were talking before about, concrete examples of loss and damage in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. All of this that we're saying is purely academic for somebody whose coast is being eroded by the sea. For anybody living in Valencia in Spain, where they had these horrible floods just less than a month ago, all of what we're talking is useless. They need action today. Even litigation takes time. Even litigation will not change everything one day to the other. And I think that's where it's a bit tricky. We can talk about these international frameworks all you want, but action happens on the ground. It happens at national government level, at national civil society level, at national private sector level. And that's where understanding how to see a win-win situation. How can we promote renewables in a way that actually promotes investment in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, creates jobs in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and unshackles you from the shackles of debt that you have and other many small island developing states and least developed countries have. That's the magic trick, which precisely because it's magic, it's quite difficult. But yeah, I'm slightly concerned of a lot of people criticizing the Paris Agreement without telling me, what do we do if we don't have the Paris Agreement? It's very easy to criticize. Give me a solution that goes beyond the Paris Agreement.
The climate litigation, not a magic trick. But in the meantime, and agreeably, it takes time.
Yeah.
But St. Vincent and the Grenadines doesn't have time. A few months ago in June, we were hit by a very devastating hurricane that wiped out about 90% of the homes, or damaged or destroyed 90% of the homes on one of our islands, caused significant damage, close to $1 billion worth in damage, estimated damage. These are not families and individuals with resources, with means. These are individuals who are depending on the assistance from their governments to restore their lives. Where is the partnership supposed to come from for islands like ours that are developing countries that are not very rich, but more so are not the ones responsible for the impact that we are feeling in climate change?
Yeah. First of all, these things are happening everywhere. And often the people in society who contribute the less and who have less are hit hardest. So this doesn't happen only in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Again, I'll take you to Valencia in Spain, which is what happened. The parts of Valencia who were underwater, where over 200 people died, were not the wealthy parts of Valencia. These were working class parts of Valencia whose buildings and cities were developed where they shouldn't have been. Now, clearly it's a completely different picture from St. Vincent and Grenadines, but there is something similar where those who have less, who contributed the least, are suffering the most. And in a way, even there, they would say, okay, who's going to pay for this? How are you going to pay for this? How can you do this fast so that I can actually reconstruct my life? So the loss and damage situation is something that is happening everywhere, not just in countries like St. Vincent and Grenadines. However, moving back to Sid's perspective, we have a situation where often the attention of politicians, media, even private sector is geared to the COP process. And we think of, okay, Baku, climate finance, let's get a big number, $1 trillion, and then magically things will happen. I'm a bit sick and tired of these numbers. Tell me more how. Tell me exactly how you're going to spend the money. Who's going to give it to you? When? How? How are you going to be accountable? The number in itself is important, but more the mechanism. And this, I think, is the criticism to Baku more than the number itself, which is very low, 300 billion per year, rather than $1 trillion. But what I really think is important is to understand that all states in the world also get together in other fora, not just the COP process. And what's very important for St. Vincent and Grenadines is the finance for development process. This happens every 5 years. The last one was in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And now we have a new framework that is being developed that will be signed off in Seville, Spain in June 2025. This is huge for small island developing states. And it comes a year after SIDS 4 in Antigua and Barbuda. We now have a 10-year blueprint for SIDS, which has a lot about debt relief, obviously, has a lot about climate change, adaptation, all sorts of things. We now need that UN structure, finance for development, where the states really get into Seville and funnel finance in the right way. And again, it's not so much how much of it, which is obviously important, it's about that. And one example, I was involved in Islands Water Congress in the Faroe Islands, but there were participation from SIDS. And one really good example from the Caribbean was some sort of an insurance scheme whereby water infrastructure hit hard by a disaster, like a hurricane, there would be a system whereby money would flow to that government quickly, in a matter of weeks, if not days, focused entirely on reconstructing and re-putting into place the water infrastructure. Now, that may not help that family whose house has either disappeared or has been hurt.
Right.
But if that family can rely on clean water quickly, that is definitely a good thing.
Yes.
So I think there are some good practices that are coming up through bilateral agency development cooperation. Obviously, the ideal world is that your government, any government, does not have to rely on financial sources elsewhere, but that can do it itself. And that's where all the efforts should go.
Well, you moved into an area of finance. So let's stay there for a little bit and ask, how important do you see the issue of debt relief, debt forgiveness, even the way countries are categorized, middle income and so forth? What connection do you see those things having with our ability to respond properly to climate change, to respond properly to disasters as a result of climate change, and start the process? And I'll give an example. We had the hurricane, and immediately the first thing we have to do is depend on countries to offer us aid. Now, fortunately for us, our government does have in place a contingencies fund that's been building. Years ago, the government tacked on I think it's a tax, a user fee on hotel rooms, and that goes directly into your contingencies fund. So we're able to tap into that immediately for some relief whenever something happened. And we had to tap into it for COVID. The very next year, after COVID, we had a volcanic eruption. We had to tap into it the next year, and we've been tapping into it. But at least that provision has been able to give us some immediate finance in terms of natural disasters. But the issues I raised a while ago, heavily indebted countries, countries that are classed as middle income countries, and therefore the rates of concessional financing different, access to it different. How important are those things for SIDS to be addressed for SIDS so that we can be able to respond?
So I think they're crucial, but there's a caveat. Let's assume an ideal world where we're talking about debt relief. So literally, debt is cancelled. If, however, over the next 10 years, the same financial architecture of the world continues, you'll just have in 10 years the same amount of debt you have now. So really, you're just going in the same cycle. So what is important, again, in an ideal world, and I cannot speak on behalf of St. Vincent de Grenade, obviously, but what you would want to have is the debt relief, so no debt, but then a system, a bit like what you just said, whereby you get grants and not loans. It's very important. And you start developing your own equity, your own finances. And let's be honest, for many SIDS, a lot of the public resources go into what? Into bringing fossil fuels, into bringing energy into your country. Quite legitimately so. A, you're not responsible for climate change. Two, you need your energy. And if you don't have it, you need to get it from somewhere else, unless you're Trinidad and Tobago. But there, again, calling them magic tricks, if a small island developing state or any country is able to stop those imports of fossil fuels and develop their own indigenous, or whatever you want to call it, renewable energy, then you don't need fossil fuel imports from Venezuela, from the States, from wherever, from Saudi Arabia. Now that's easier said than done. We have those problems in the UK, Italian, we have problems in Italy, connections with Spain, problems everywhere like that. But let's be honest, if we're serious about a climate emergency, and if we're serious about not having debt in our countries, really there's only one solution, which is developing your own renewable energy, creating a system whereby you do not need more debt going forward, but you create your own financial resources, and you become not just a sovereign independent state as you are, but what's the purpose of being a sovereign independent state if every time you need something you have to go ask somebody else? That's not sovereignty. So again, I'm simplifying it tremendously, but I do think the finance for development negotiations that are happening in New York, that will end in Seville, are potentially even more important than Baku and the climate change process now, and will feed into the implementation of the SIDS4 agenda and in the negotiations in COP30 at the end of next year.
We're chatting with my good friend, my former professor, but still professor, of course, my former professor, when I studied at Strathclyde, professor in international environmental law, Francesco Sindico, about issues relating to climate change, climate litigation, and so forth. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we talk to Francesco about the relevance of people like him and institutions that he works for in assisting not just the global situation, but specifically those countries that need the assistance most, small island developing states. Don't worry, we'll be right back.
Covering 150 years of history, relating the story of 5 generations. It took 12 years to write, and now it's finally here. The story of Pauline Bramble, Springs, Blossoms, and Young Thorns, a literary masterpiece by Dr. Richard A. Byron Cox, author of the critically acclaimed Where Mama Stares in Vain. Pauline Bramble's story is your great-great-grandparents, great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, and your story. It is our story of pain, love, tears, and joys. Our story of struggle with no surrender. It's a golden gift to our nation as we mark 45 years of independence. Get your copy and a gift for a friend for this independence from Games Bookshop, Career City Store, Giggles at AIA, and Jazzy's at the Cruise Ship Berth. It is our story like never told before. The story of Pauline Bramble. Read it and be inspired.
Welcome back to your favorite Thursday evening program, Uplift with Sarah Marshall. And yes, I'm here in Glasgow, Scotland, on the campus of my old university, the University of Strathclyde, chatting with Professor Francesco Sindico, who is Professor of International Environmental Law here at the university. We've had a pretty good discussion so far. Francesco, universities do a lot of research. Yourself explained at the beginning that one of the things that you have been involved in, lots of research. What impact do you think, of what use is your research to the challenges faced by small island development states? And I ask that because small island states, apart from their peculiarities regarding climate change, they're also smaller and poorer, so they do not have the resources, the expertise, and so forth. And maybe they would love to be able to look at some research done by Strathclyde or some other reputable university and be able to glean some practicable ideas that they can use to address their situation, whether it's how to deal with finance, whether it's how to deal with the issue of renewable energy, how to deal with negotiations and so forth. Do you think universities and researchers do enough to assist in that regard?
So I'll tell you what we do not do well and what we should do better. Hopefully, even somebody, one of your listeners or viewers, maybe we can start a relationship like that, because I'm very keen to do things differently. Where I think universities, be it in the UK or anywhere, to be honest, don't do everything well, is when we develop the research question by ourselves. So we come into the university, we come up with an idea, and we spend time and resources answering that question. Then we put it down in a very long journal article that nobody will read. And we give ourselves pat on the back. Now, I'm not saying that this per se is useless. There's potentially a lot of contribution to knowledge. There's some new ideas that come out that may be picked up. But the real highlight there is may be picked up. Quite random. So when it comes to small island development states or any user, be it the school I mentioned before, be it a company, be it a community, what I think is needed, and it's easier said than done because it's a lot about personal relationships, is to co-develop the research question together with, be it a government or a media organization or whoever it is that you want to work with. And it's not so much about developing the right question, because that will always be fine-tuned. It's about developing that mutual trust and confidence between the researchers and the users of that research. And the reason that it's so important is that if you, be it a government, want an answer to a question that you have co-produced or are involved in, you know what? You will be waiting for that answer. The real big problem for so many researchers. We spend so much time giving an answer, but then we don't know who's going to read it. So a lot of time needs to go into this relationship and understanding what is it that the government and civilians and the specific ministry and so forth wants to know, be it the finance for development process, be it the implementation of the loss of damage fund, whatever it is. And then give that answer, understanding that they will read your piece of paper and give it them in a way that ministers and officials can actually deal with it. And also people working outside of government, so plain language, shorter versions, executive summaries, podcasts, you name it. You have to be creative there. And then things don't have to stop there. the user, say the government, they need to come back to you with questions. They have to ask you to come. It doesn't have to be in person, but and if need be, for further research, for a follow-up that again needs to be co-produced. So it's a cycle. If we don't do research on that cycle, then anything we will do will, in my opinion, not be feasible. When it comes to exactly what, I myself have been working on exactly what I was telling before. Renewable energy in small island developing states. How can you promote it in a way that does not undermine marine and terrestrial biodiversity, and putting the communities of that states or island front and center of the decision-making process. And we try to do that cycle with the government of Vanuatu, and we're very keen to do it also with other small island developing states, but only if we develop that trust and confidence. And interestingly, we do it not just at Strathclyde, but we do it in collaboration with the Climate Change Legal Initiative, with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. When it comes to the International Water Resources Association, for example, we're looking at water management policies for islands more generally, SIDS, and for example, in the Faroe Islands, we're developing together, we're assisting, let's say, stakeholders in the country to the reform of their own water law. So we do a lot of things, but we want to do them better. And the only way to do them better is to start talking with people like yourselves and your viewers and listeners to co-develop that research.
Well, so I think we need to end this because, I mean, by the time you're seeing this, everything would have ended. But the truth is, this is being recorded in the morning before a number of events that Francesco has to be a part of, including his own inaugural election in a couple of hours. So I'm going to have to let him go. But just in closing, Francesco, therefore, if you look forward to the future, can we, as a world generally, but of course my bias, small island states specifically, look towards the international environmental architecture, including the Paris Agreement and other treaties, as well as you mentioned, the financing for development process, and think that even with the most cynicism, there is hope for us?
Yes,
going forward?
yes, there is, but we have to work with what we have until we develop anything new. And what I mean by that is that we can be, as you said, cynical, angry sometimes with the Baku COP, with the Paris Agreement process, with the cases that we see in front of us. But as creative and good lawyers, we need to work with what we have for the interests of our client. Here, the client could be the earth, if you want,
Yeah.
and make things work. There will be some setbacks, there always will be, but I do think that we can move in the right direction. What I would say, and it goes back to your previous question though, what I also think is that it is very important that even if the numbers are obviously smaller, be it in, say, Vincent and Grenadines, but it could be the Solomon Islands, it could be any SIDS, there needs to be a conversation and training with universities, not just here in the UK, quite the opposite, in situ, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, to develop, and I'm struggling to say the right kind of lawyers, but the professions that are needed to do that completely, almost Copernican change of renewable energy, of debt relief, and of an island, a country, a government that is truly independent. And it also really has to come from the island itself. Yes, there are a lot of struggles, there are a lot of problems, but the impetus has to come from the island itself, from the country itself. It cannot come from the UK, it should never come from the UK. If we living in Scotland, working in Europe, can be of assistance, obviously we'll be delighted to do that. But actually, we will learn so much from people like yourself, from colleagues in SIDS, that may actually also be of use to islands here in Scotland or islands across Europe. But yes, I am optimistic. We have to be optimistic. And we need to work with what we have until we develop something.
All right. Unfortunately, we weren't able to touch on the just concluded COP in Baku, but we could always have that conversation another time.
Absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening on another edition of Update with Sion Marshall. On behalf of my guest, Professor Francesco Sindico, my good friend Francesco, Thank you so much. And until next week, have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you.